Hi. Today we're gonna mostly be getting what I call a crash course in ecology. Some of this will be really easy for some of you. It will be a review of something you might have learned in high school biology, of what may have been covered in your introduction to biology classes. And if you are an upperclassman, biology or environmental science major, and have had ecology, you should have no problem with this at all. So we're just going to go through some terms because some of this stuff will be used later and is important for understanding different threats to biodiversity and understanding kind of different tools we can use to help preserve biodiversity, which will be the later part of the course. So, what is ecology? Everybody's familiar with the word ecology. So I want you to think about for a second what that means. You can pause the video if nothing comes to mind right away to give you a second to actually think about it. Now, a typical definition will say something like the study of interactions among organisms and their environment. And it has a lot to do with understanding why animals and plants and other organisms live where they do, and how they go about getting the resources they need to survive, grow, and reproduce. This is important background, as I said, for understanding how different stressors affect biodiversity and the solutions to those different threats. So, environmental factors can determine where an organism can live. And these include lots of different things. It might include the abiotic environment, which, if you'll remember, those are the non-living parts of an ecosystem. So that could be moisture, temperature, pH, light, nutrients. It also involves other species as well. So the prey, shelter needed, breeding, nesting sites. It can also include what competitors can that species deal with and live with. If another competitor outcompetes them and they can't live with that competitor, then that's not part of where they can live. It also has to deal with what predators can they handle as a population. What about parasites and disease? And an example here is the queen snake, which is a crayfish specialist, and it's really limited in where it can live based on where its food source lives, the crayfish. Now, there are two terms that sometimes people use interchangeably, but they really mean two different things, and that's habitat and ecological niche. A habitat is basically where an organism lives, and it includes the different conditions that it needs to live. A niche is the total set of environmental factors that determine a species' distribution. So it might include lots of other species and how they interact with that species, not just what they need to live in an area. And we often group organisms into different groups based on their niche. And we say that generalists have a very broad niche, meaning that they can live under a lot of different circumstances. And so an example of this is the raccoon, which can eat lots of different foods. It can live in lots of different ecosystems. It doesn't need one specific thing in order to survive. A specialist has a very narrow niche, and a classic example of this is the giant panda. It only eats bamboo. It only eats certain kinds of bamboo, and it really can't just live anywhere. It needs this really specific food resource and really specific type of habitat. And that's why the giant panda is highly endangered and the raccoon is not anywhere close to being endangered. They're thriving in cities, in forests, in grasslands, all over the place. Raccoons can make a living. Tolerance limits have to deal with the minimum and maximum levels that a species can survive and reproduce. And we could look at any kind of environmental gradient and look at tolerance limits. Pretty much anything you could think of, there is a maximum and a minimum of which a particular species can deal with and still survive and reproduce. And we can look at this. We have an optimal range, which is where the species does the best and it survives the best and reproduces the best. And then there are these zones on either side of physiological stress, see here, where the species can survive and reproduce, but just barely. It's not increasing greatly, it's not taking over or anything. It's just barely making it. And then the zones of intolerance at these ends are where something is either too high or too low, and the population just cannot persist because there's not the right conditions for survival and reproduction. So some examples of this, different environmental gradients. Things like temperature is an easy one to think about. There are some places that are simply too hot for a species and some places that are simply too cold. And there's an optimal range of temperature that the species is going to need. pH is the same way. We could also think about moisture. So there are some ecosystems that have lots of moisture, like a lake, and there are others that have very, very little, like a desert. And their species have different tolerances for the amount of moisture that they can deal with. And we can think about all sorts of things, like different nutrients for plants, different types of soil, different amounts of wind. There's all different environmental gradients that have these different tolerance limits. Limiting resources are a resource that controls how well a species can survive and reproduce. And the limiting resource is the one that if you can add more of it, the species will increase. So they'll either have better survival or reproduce better if you add this limiting resource in. If you add more of a particular resource in and it doesn't change the survival or reproduction of the species likely needs it, but it's not limiting if it doesn't increase the growth rate of that population. So an example here is a bat that requires a really specific roosting habitat, and the species may be limited by the availability of that habitat. So if more roosting habitat became available, the population would grow. But if it's at capacity, the population isn't going to increase in numbers until there's more roosting habitat available. Or we might decrease the size of the population if we take some roosting habitat away or damage the roosting habitat. So the limiting resource here is roosting habitat. Limiting resources. There's another term that we often think about, and that's carrying capacity. And it has to do with the total number of individuals a species can have in a certain ecosystem based on the amount of resources that are available. And so as resources become more scarce, the population levels out. So you hit what's called this carrying capacity, and that's the maximum number of individuals that ecosystem can sustain of that particular species. So here we see the wolves. They increase through time, and then when they start running out of resources, probably prey items, then they will kind of level out. Now, a lot of times, carrying capacity, they overshoot it, which you can see here with the moose. So while there's lots of resources, they might have more babies than the ecosystem can support. And so it'll overshoot the carrying capacity, and then there'll be a dieback where a lot of individuals will die, and it'll bring the population back below the carrying capacity, and then they'll have extra resources again, and they'll make too many babies, and then they'll overshoot the carrying capacity. So sometimes you don't just naturally go up to the carrying capacity. Ecology can be messy, and it has to do with the life history of the species or the timing and process of reproduction and survival in that species life cycle. It's pretty common for predators to be below their carrying capacity. And as I said before, if a species exceeds its carrying capacity, it will run out of resources and the population will crash. Environmental changes can also affect resource availability. So for the moose, they're eating plants if that's their limiting resource. In wetter years, there might be more plants and the carrying capacity might go up a little bit. And in drought years, the amount of plants might decrease and the carrying capacity may go down. So it's not always a fixed number. It might change with different environmental conditions.